Tracy, I think it's fair to say relative to Louise that extremism is more like at the heart of at least some of your research. So could you just maybe situate your own thinking and research in relation to extremism?
Absolutely. Thanks, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a philosopher of extremism. I like trying to make sense of social phenomena and practices in extremist cultures and movements that at first glance absolutely do not make sense. But if you further investigate what's going on, they actually do. And then I formulate philosophical concepts that can better capture and explain the things I'm investigating. So, for example, I was really curious about the individuals Megan Phelps Roper and Derek Black. They respectively grew up in the Westboro Baptist Church and in the center of the white power movement in the United States. But eventually, they completely disavowed their identities and adopted identities that are completely the opposite of who they were growing up. So I wrote about the apostasy and conversion cases of what they call group egotists or persons raised in hate groups. So that's the first interesting, bizarre case. The second, I became curious about the women in white extremist groups. So these include like the trad wives you see in social media, the white power Barbies, these propagandists who support racist and anti-feminist ideas. And I was curious about the misogyny that they both promote online and at the same time, the misogyny that they experience. So I wrote about the concept of the misogyny paradox in the alt-right to make sense of this. And then finally, I was really interested in the question of what kind of agency Islamic female terrorists had, whether it was like a full agency or just a facade of agency. And my hunch that this was like a very incorrect binary framing of what's going on. So I developed this concept of women's hate agency to illustrate how both patriarchal practices and extremism structure the agency that women terrorists exercise. So basically, like I'm looking at the extremists who aren't at the center of the movement, so not the men who are carrying the guns or with the swastika tattoos. Like I'm looking at the women, the children, all the fringe figures that we often take for granted. And that's how I think of extremism.
Thanks, Tracy. Where does sort of definitional work fit into your work on extremism? I know someone like Kasim Kassam, who's written a book on it. He's very sort of, you know, and maybe you might say typical philosophical style, kind of interested in getting a tight definition. Do you operate in that way, or do you tend to kind of see extremism as too nebulous a concepts? You try to sort of focus on specific examples like you described to kind of get a family resemblance vibe going on?
Absolutely. So the second avenue, I find that Kasim Kassam's work is so enriching and so wonderful in laying out, how we can make sense of extremism and who extremists are. But my approach has been to look at the social practices that extremist cultures engage in. So I'm less interested in trying to, be able to say, oh, that person is an extremist or that belief is an extremist. But it's more like what kind of culture is being perpetuated and what kind of social practices are being engaged in by persons who already identify or are already being identified as extremists in a very general sense. And in approaching it that way, we see that the extremists that really concern us today are those that actually fall into the three categories that Kassam outlined. So those who have ideological beliefs that fall outside of the political spectrum or at the ends of the political spectrum, those who are already psychologically quite extremist in profile, so very bigoted, suspicious of outsiders, and these are also people who engage in violence. So an extremist then would be someone like Anders Breivik, the 2011 neo-Nazi terrorist responsible for the Norway terrorist attacks, or Momina Sharma in Australia, who is an Islamic female terrorist who was convicted of terrorism, and she was from Bangladesh. So these are the individuals that really interest me, and that's my approach to extremism, to look at the actual cases and the practices.
Super. So, Louise, having read quite a lot of your work in the last couple of weeks, it's fair to say that extremism per se isn't necessarily a word that would be on your list of research interests, but one of the things you've written extensively about from many angles is gender, and I think we can certainly see, I mean, you'd know better than me whether you think it's an increasing trend, but there is certainly a link between gender studies, criticism of gender, Judith Butler's account of gender, and extremist movements. Could you say something about maybe your research more generally, and how questions of extremism either are beginning to creep into it, or maybe have been there all along, albeit perhaps a little bit more hidden than it is now?
Absolutely. The thing that really motivates my analysis of the social is looking for the social imaginaries that underscore the things that make people feel strongly about topics, what makes the world meaningful for them in the particular way that it does, what makes some norms seem absolutely incontrovertible, others challengeable. And I take that kind of positionality with me to the topics that I'm interested in understanding, which started back in my PhD research actually with the issue of same-sex marriage and the ways in which there were these hidden images of queer couples that underscored different arguments in favor of same-sex marriage, and whether or not advancing those kinds of tacit images would actually be beneficial and liberatory for the queer community. And so now I find myself coming back to queer rights in particular, as I've been doing some work on the problem of religious freedom versus, this is how it's characterized in the Australian discourse at the moment, versus queer rights to non-discrimination. But in coming back to this topic, it's been absolutely impossible to avoid recognition of how polarized the issue of trans identity is in contemporary Western societies, in particular the US, the UK, and Australia. And what I'm quite interested in is understanding the narratives that convince people, seemingly without any kind of wiggle room for thought, critique, or reconsideration, that that either trans and gender diversity is a real genuine phenomenon that needs to be supported in a particular sort of way, or it's a mental illness, or it's the effects of a dangerous ideology, and it's changing the world in ways that are both scary and unimaginable. And I think what is really interesting there is the way in which science is being used as a master narrative in both directions. Science is being used to both justify trans and gender healthcare, but it's also being used to undercut the models for trans and gender healthcare that we have now. And what's interesting about it is both sides believe they're following the science, but there is some pseudoscience going on here, most certainly. So how do we unpack this and deliver this to a, frankly, very fearful public?
Yeah, I mean, the comment you made there that there's both sides are trying to follow the science and there's pseudoscience floating around. I guess the obvious question is, how do we delineate one from the other? Because yeah, I've obviously been in anticipation of this event typing pseudoscience and this, pseudoscience and that. And yeah, as you said, like I came across immediate examples of both sides of the gender debate, accusing each other of manipulating the science, using the science for their own ends, being lost in ideology and those kind of things. I mean, I suppose for people that maybe are not skilled in interpreting science, like what are the things that we can look out for in either this debate specifically or more generally in the areas where extremism, pseudoscience may be at play?
Yeah, and I mean, this is not just tied to the issue of trans and gender diversity. This is true for any social situation where science is positioned as the determining factor of what is right and what is wrong. So we've seen this with climate science, for example. Unfortunately, the science has gone and public opinion has gone largely in the direction of believing that climate change is a real phenomenon. But the same type of arguments were playing out in this discourse as well. And I think something that's interesting to consider is to what extent we would be seeing such emphatic discussion of the science if gender fluidity was not as scary as it is, if it didn't capture the imaginations of some members of society in ways that spell out either complete denial of the natural world as it exists, or complete denial of some sort of God's plan for how humanity ought to be engaged with one another. And the tempering of emotion and even kind of latent affect as well, not even, you know, strictly conscious in the mind emotion, I think might change people's willingness to see whether or not what is being presented to them as scientific and irrefutable can be interpreted in a different way, whether it's because different clinical standards need to apply, whether it's simply because there's not been enough time to create longitudinal studies, and etc. So I think that dealing with both emotions and images is really important here, but science itself has this predominant image in the public consciousness, and that's why it's doing the work that it's doing, because it is a master discourse.
Yeah. Actually, if I could jump on that, I love your discussion of, you know, the idea of gender and the, you know, how the idea of gender is being challenged today, like really strikes at the heart of, you know, our sense of who we are as human beings or how we've organized the world. And just, you know, some people can't handle that. So from the perspective of people receiving, you know, this new input, it can be pretty shocking. And I think a way of like expanding our perception of what's going on is by looking at how extremist cultures and extremist movements actually use the science, the master, the source of authority, in, you know, devilish and pernicious ways. Because extremists use science as a tool or a weapon for legitimizing their extremist agenda, justifying their views, or defending even their acts of violence. So science for extremists lends an objective and rationalist backbone to hate and terror. So what's important to take into consideration here is that, you know, white extremist groups and many white extremist groups are definitely in the category of those who want to preserve a very biologistic essentialist understanding of gender. They not only have a short-term political agenda of making sure, say, we limit immigration, or that, you know, we don't have, you know, our reproductive rights aren't being respected, but their politics is usually guided by a vision of a utopia, or, you know, utopia for them, but a dystopia for us. So in the case, for instance, of white women extremists, they want communities with white nuclear families that follow the gender hierarchy. White extremists want a white ethno-state. Anti-Semitic Christian identity hate groups want everyone to be Christians. And eco-fascists, you know, they're obsessed about communing with nature only if, you know, the other people communing with nature are also Aryans. So in other ways, like they already have not just a short-term perspective, but they also have a long-term agenda in mind. And that really, in my view, skews the way they're able to interpret and engage any kind of scientific data that goes their way, even the legitimate science or the pseudoscience. And when we put that into, we take that into perspective, then we, kind of can divide the audience from those who are receivers of the information to those who are actually manufacturing or packaging how the information will be received.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as well it involves some degree of epistemic trespassing too. This idea that we can sort of take on these findings of science, be they legitimate or illegitimate, and we can stand as some sort of authority to represent, what the science truly means, what it does in fact tell us objectively about how the world is, how the world ought to be. And I find this is used very often with respect to reproduction, and so really emphasizing a sexual binary, and like this key dispute over whether or not sex is binary seems to be pushing people to extremes when it comes to gender ideology, be they people who think it's not real and people who think it is absolutely incontrovertibly real. Because how could you possibly believe that a reproductive coupling is not the center of human sexual dimorphism, And so I really think that this epistemic trespassing that goes along with presenting some of the facts as if they are obvious and incontrovertible, and not just that I'm an authority to speak on them because of my qualification in this area, or because I've been involved in this reference group, or because XYZ reason. And I think that there's not a lot of literacy around the concept of sex and gender, generally speaking, but also in terms of identifying who is expert enough, whose testimony I ought to be valuing.
Thanks. So I thought we'd continue with the gender thread, because obviously if Tracy's looking primarily in things she was discussed as, I think, what we would call fairly uncontroversially extremist groups, there is a sense in which the gender debate is something that, well, firstly, almost everyone feels they have a right to kind of weigh in with their opinions, but if you like, it's also something that isn't obviously an extremist thing, like you can have your opinions. But the interesting thing for the purpose of our discussion is that Judith Butler recently released a book called, is it Who's Afraid of Gender? And you reviewed it, Louise, for the conversation. And I haven't read the book, but the impression I got from your review and a couple of others is that Butler is increasingly making the link between gender critical stances and extremist organizations, especially fascist governments. Could you try and sort of flesh out this more extremist trajectory that Butler is trying to draw our attention to?
Absolutely. So this new book by Butler, first of all, it's designed for a general audience, not specifically an academic audience. For that, I think it is a reasonably challenging book to read. But that aside, there's two sort of main arguments that Butler is making in this book. One of them relates to a politics of alliance. And so this argument that equality for any of us entails that we work in an alliance, even when we come into tensions with those others who are pursuing a particular egalitarian gender, but only perhaps for like one specific marginal group and not across the board. So it's a call to stand up for each other's attempts to create a more equal society, basically. And then the second thing that Butler does is to link both governments, conservative religious ideologies, particular think groups and organizations, and also even trans exclusionary radical feminists or gender critical feminists together, and say that these, while these bodies come apart with respect to some of their beliefs, ultimately what underscores all of them with respect to gender is a conservative ideology that's based in sexual dimorphism, which denies people's agency in determining who they are and denies the existence of intersex people because it doesn't, their bodies don't fit the model of a dimorphic sex division. And so if we can see that, let's say the Vatican has a position on sex and gender that would be detrimental to even heterosexual cisgender women, in that it kind of re-emphasizes the role of women to bear children and be mothers and etc., then we should also be looking at those other examples which maybe don't strike us immediately as being problematic and go, these are the people that I should be aligning with. And Butler, like, without question, thinks this is fascism. They say it on several occasions that this anti-gender ideology, it's like she calls it anti-gender ideology. That's the movement she describes for people who oppose trans and gender diversity. So she describes that position as itself an ideology. So it's anti-gender ideology is fascist in that it is denying their argument. It is denying people's abilities to live. It wants to eradicate these people's existence. It wants everybody to have to be conformed within this neat little box. Sorry, I haven't moved enough this conversation. My lights just turned off automatically. And in order to oppose fascism, we need to be on board with trans and gender diversity. I can see the logic connecting these claims because it is linked in Butler's view to things like the colonial project, capitalism, and etc. So that's part of why Butler's drawing these bigger links to fascism, generally speaking, as opposed to it just being this one tiny little idea that's fascist. But certainly, I think it's not necessarily helpful to be describing the whole situation as a fascist situation if what we need to do is get people to think more critically about the information that they're being presented. So while I can see the links, I also don't know that I want to go so far as to say that this ideological position is extremist in the same way we would describe white nationalism as extremist, for instance.
Thank you. That's really a useful overview. I mean, one of the things I was wanting just to follow up on before we return to Tracy is a phrase. I can't remember which of your papers I read it in, but it was meaning vertigo, or not like definite, but like a vertigo of meaning or something, which you describe as a vertiginous and unsettling emptiness at the level of social meaning. And I found that so interesting because it seems often that extremist responses are these, I mean, maybe we could discuss a little bit some of the psychological characteristics of the extremist that may have been looked into, but I suppose there's a sense in which when neat and clear binary black and white style pictures are not offered, which in a way Butler is the exemplary of not offering that. They are, I think, constantly trying to keep things very fluid. There is a sense in which this vertigo sets in, and it's as if the extremist reaction comes out of this panic at what you call an emptiness at the level of social meaning. I mean, could you say a little bit more about that phrase and how widespread you see that phenomenon as being?
Yeah, the term itself was coined by Philippa Melo-Lopes, who I think is at University of Edinburgh. And she did some interesting work about post-feminist backlash and kind kind of created this concept to describe what happened, following the second wave feminist liberation movement, which is that, there was critique of all of the things that were wrong, but there was not a ready replacement. And so some people found themselves kind of going in hard, reimposing the norms that had already been there in terms of women's sexual objectification, for instance. And I think that it's a useful concept because it really speaks to the need for our sense-making narratives to be ready in place and to be resonant enough to make new sense out of the world in a way that's consistent with the old sense of the world. If there isn't enough resonance overlapping the two ways of understanding what the world is like, then that's where you get this gap where meaning completely collapses. And what can you do in order to restabilize yourself, but re-emphasize as emphatically as you can exactly what it is you take to be true? And I think that you see that with the case of people responding to the notion that sex could be a social construction as opposed to gender being a social construction, when it just seems obviously true and incontrovertibly so that men are men and women are women, and that's the way the world naturally is. So if you try to give me a narrative that says, actually, no, that's not the case, it's not true that sex is dimorphic, there's no resonance, there's no overlap. And what we're missing is the ability to create that space for resonance and overlap, because otherwise the imposition of the particular worldview that's being challenged will just have people digging in their heels harder, and they will be more resistant to change.
Thank you so much. Tracy, was there anything you wanted to follow up on and anything Louise said?
No, not really. I think Louise said it all, and it was brilliant. The only thing I wanted to add is at least in the extremist movements that I've been looking at, so white extremist groups, Islamic or Islamist terror movements, if in a general sense, we're so concerned about or the world has this panic about the idea of gender. If you look at the cultures of these groups, what's really problematic about them as well is, their obsession in making sure the gender hierarchy remains as it is, i.e. the men on top, the women are the other. The women come second place. And that's the classic way of making sure that there is someone providing service, someone else who is subordinate, someone else who performs all of the domestic duties so that another category can thrive. So in that particular, emphasis in this conception of a hierarchy, we can now see the panic that arises in society. What do you mean we can't have this order anymore where our natural needs are being met? If you're disrupting an order that has been legitimized and recognized by extremist groups as far away from each other as Islamic terrorism and white supremacist movements, then there is something about gender. I think that is really crucial in terms of unpacking and understanding, since it seems to, to be something so familiar and something so panic-worthy in different kinds of cultures and political structures.
Super. So I was going to take a little bit of a different turn. One of the things I noticed in reading your work, Tracy, is, we've been talking a little bit about ways in which certain groups may engage with ideas around science. They may, for example, have their own way of operationalizing ideas around objectivity or truth towards their own ends. But I noticed in your work, and you were talking, I suppose, a little bit about equality here in relation to hierarchy, but there are a lot of other, what we call sort of Enlightenment values that were being kind of, to put a negative spin on it, twisted or reappropriated to suit the ends of extremist things like autonomy and freedom. Could you say something about the ways in which these other, what you may call core Enlightenment values, are being reshaped or remolded? And I suppose a further question would be, isn't this sort of unavoidable in a pluralistic society, that people have the right to turn conventional notions of freedom on its head and say that they are the true defenders of freedom?
Yeah, so that's great. And especially relevant because I'm living here in the United States, where the language of rights and the language of freedom like dominate all political and public discourses. So what's interesting about this perspective, so I'm taking here the perspective of the white extremist groups that I study. There is this firm belief in at least those who work or who have far-right views or who affiliate themselves with white supremacist views, that all of these Enlightenment products, these Enlightenment values, were generated and created, if at all, by Western civilization. So this is a uniquely Western, these are all unique Western achievements. So putting it that way, it means, they recognize themselves as a step up in comparison to all other kinds of civilizations. And to some extent, it's also being argued by these groups that they have a legitimate claim towards the kind of interpretation and expression of all of these different freedoms, of all of these, different expressions of autonomy or expressions of rights. So that's one way by which you could think of how, extremists co-opt these conceptions. The second, I think, is that now that we're living in a more, globalized world where, different cultures interact on a day-to-day basis, there's the perception that all of those achievements, Enlightenment achievements, are now being challenged or now being, co-opted or applied in different ways by non-Western cultures. And, this is a convenient way of like being able to compare about how Americans, for instance, are able to exercise their freedom in comparison to like non-free democracies in the global South. So it's also being used, or these particular values are also being used as the standards by which they can white supremacists can criticize other groups as less competent, as not, as impressive as Western culture that was able to generate and live up to those values. And when these values are being challenged or negated or threatened, they show up in full force. So it's no coincidence, that the white power movement, the Patriot Front, like they're all championing these particular ideas that have their, to some extent, their genesis in the Enlightenment movement as, things that they are as values that need defending in modern day. So that's how extremists treat these values. It's their own and not any other cultures.
Brilliant, thank you. Louise, is there anything you want to follow up on in anything Tracy said?
No, I think Tracy did a great job with that question. I don't think I would think more useful to it. I mean, I don't want to waffle,
Okay, well, let's turn to the audience questions. I can see that quite a lot have come in. I've been unable to look through them, but let's just start at the top. So this is a question from Elka. Hello, Elka, one of our most loyal attendees and friends. Is there a generationally significant difference in the interpretation and application of extremism? Is it clear which generation has a greater impact on social sensibility, and how is that evident? Tracy, do you want to have a pop at Elka's question?
Okay, I'll try, and I'll try to rephrase it in the way I understand it. So I hope, Elka, that I'm getting the gist right. So is there a difference between, I suppose, how, extremist idea or extremist cultures were being treated and received in the past compared to, say, the generation that we have today, or the world in which these extremist ideas gain traction? And if that's the question, then the answer would be yes, there's a significant difference, because now we live in the age where the internet exists, and extremist ideas just get shared much faster, much quicker. You have a lot of technologies that, from memes to games, to message boards, to Instagram, like, where extremists can generate content that will allow not only for its immediate spread, but also that will appeal to a greater number of folks. So in the 1970s or the 1980s, white power movements, like, they were like the first internet users, like, seriously, like they had it going on. They had like these DSL connections and passwords, so they can exchange extremist ideas. It wasn't just going to be snail mail. Whereas now, like, they're everywhere on YouTube, and they get more and more people hooked on the basis of things that appeal to particular sectors of people. So in terms of, like, are we in danger of being targeted or being exposed to more extremist ideas and more effectively? Then I would say yes. I hope I got your question right, Elka.
I think you did a great job. There's always the risk that written questions are difficult to get, but I thought you certainly spun it in a way that made it a very interesting answer. Louise, is there anything that you want to pick up on in Elka's question or Tracy's response?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the way in which our historical positionality can lead us to interpreting some things as extremist, whereas in the moment, the dominant perception may be that it's not extremist. And I was thinking about the ways in which, like, eugenicist thinking, for example, was really transnational, and it really involved a lot of some spread, granted, the old, not via the internet, of course, which would have made things much more rapid and unimaginably worse, no doubt, but the spread of this kind of ideological position about, we need to breed a better race, whether that comes in the form of them being white or, not the feeble-minded, but the rational, capable, competent, moral adults. And I think now, when we look back at that, we can see it as, if not extremist itself, then tending towards extremism. And it makes me think about what we'll be evaluating today when we can, in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, when we're looking back at this, thinking about the exact same question, like, is it the case that it was different in the past to what it is today, or in what ways? I mean, there might be a hell of a lot more extremism going on now than we care to interpret it as such.
Super, thank you. So okay, so we'll go for a question from Dee Smith. Hello again, Dee. I know you were at the event earlier, so thank you for sort of pitching in for this one too. So Dee asks, what are the end goals of extremism, and how do extremists define success for their movements and efforts? Is their goal disruption, ensuring anger grows, creating isolated groups, creating wide social change, all of the above, mutatis mutandis? Louise, do you fancy having a first stab at Dee's question?
Yeah, I was actually I just started taking notes because I didn't want to forget the things that were popping into my mind. What is the goal? Imaginal order, by which I mean kind of control over the dominant social imaginary, but also actual power that they can make use of, whether that comes in a kind of state form or an interpersonal form. I think there's always two parts to the story, right? It's the imposition of a singular worldview. This is the way it is. This is the way it should be. This is the only way it can be, as well as the ability to enforce it.
Nice, thank you. Tracy, any follow-up on Dee's question or Louise's response?
Absolutely. So I'm approaching this from the perspective of the two general movements I've been looking at, Islamist terror groups and white extremist movements. So in their case, you know, they do have like these, to them, utopian visions of what a society would be. So following through Louise's explanation, but in their case, they're at a point where we don't have to convert everyone in the world into our worldview, but we just want our own without people, you know, other cultures interfering. So white supremacist groups in the United States, for instance, they want their own white ethno-states. If you throw in the Christian identity groups, it also has to be Christian and white. For Islamist terrorists, they attempted to do that in Syria by trying to create the Islamic State. So it's the creation of the Ummah, their nation, where you follow a social order that patterns what a good, you know, an extreme Islamist religious society should be. So it really, you know, when we think of Louise's idea of social imaginaries and how they operate and the, you know, the kind of order that they want in the long term, you know, the parallelism is there. And in terms of like, what are the strategies, what are the tactics? My answer is yes, it's actually all of the above, D, and many, many more to get to that stage.
Awesome, thank you so much. So so this is a good sort of clarificatory question from Joe. It's probably one I should have asked earlier, but the conversation veered off. So would it be possible to provide a specific example of where pseudoscience has been used to validate an extremist example? So yeah, we were talking in kind of broad brushstrokes about the phenomenon, but I think Joe's wanting some concrete examples. Louise, do you fancy having a shot at that, perhaps in relation to Judith Butler's idea of fascist anti-gender ideology, or whatever comes to mind?
I mean, I can have a crack at this, but I think like with the asterisk caveat that there's a lot of disagreement about whether or not this is extreme, right? So, but we have, for example, suggestions that pseudoscientific organizations are being established and have been established primarily over the last few years in order to undermine the ability of trans people to have kind of basic equal rights, but also specifically access to particular forms of healthcare that they feel will be beneficial. And so there have been some recent ones established, like GenSpect or Gender Exploratory Therapeutic Association. And in addition to kind of arguably skewing the science that is available about the benefits of healthcare and the rates of regret and the rates of detransition and these sorts of things, we get sort of the pseudoscience aspect coming into it there, but it also is arguably an exercise in astroturfing, where it makes it seem like there's a lot of grassroots concern coming up about a particular issue, and concerns coming up from different areas to legitimize it, to make it seem like it's genuinely widespread, though it's not. So it has the benefit of creating doubt, even creating fear, and that in turn can be enough to stop people from engaging in further acts that would be beneficial to the trans and gender diverse community from the perspective of the trans and gender diverse community.
Awesome, thank you. Tracy, do you have any thoughts on Joe's question about specific examples of pseudoscience?
Yes. So if Louise gave the, it's contentious if it's extremist, I'm going to give the extremist pseudoscience examples. So conspiracy theorist David Irving, so he's a Holocaust denier. So in his books, he used the Loiter report, which was commissioned by Ernst Zundel for his defense in a trial against him for distributing anti-Semitic propaganda in Canada. So the 1998 report is pseudoscientific, it's flawed. It showed that the person who engaged in the research wasn't qualified to do that kind of research, but it was being passed on in David Irving's work as legitimate science to prove that the Holocaust didn't happen. One that's, really scary is like the continued propagation of race research. So an American historian, an extremism researcher, Cynthia Miller-Idris points out, despite strong evidence that race has little biological basis, 99.9% of the human genome is identical across races, you still have this like huge interest in race science in the far right. So you find that in white supremacist journals, pseudoscience journals, and newsletters like the Mankind Quarterly. I just Googled, like it does exist, and promote itself as a legitimate, scientific enterprise. You have that in Jared Taylor's American Renaissance, which basically like promote eugenicist arguments as a genetic basis for intelligence. So basically following through with the sad success of the infamous 1994 book, The Bell Curve, which makes the same argument. And right now you see funding bodies such as the Pioneer Fund, like actually funding institutes that promote research that highlight differences between races in terms of IQ, sporting ability, strength, whatever differences that you can find that can be used as a way of legitimizing the idea that, people from different races are fundamentally different. So those are examples of pseudoscientific arguments, institutions, and publications that still exist today and are being financially supported for far right and to support really radically problematic positions.
Thank you. So there's a question here from Mark, which is addressed specifically to you, Tracy, although it may well be that Louise has read the referred to book as well and can chime in. But anyway, the question is, have you read any of Eric Hoffer's work on extremism, such as The True Believer? If so, what relevance do you think his work has to the present day? So I'm guessing Eric Hoffer must have been an extremism researcher from a while back.
Yeah, he's called the longshoreman philosopher because that's his job. So thank you, Mark. I love this because I actually teach Eric Hoffer. So I teach a graduate seminar here at UConn on extremism and transformative experience. And after Kasim Kassam's work, like he is the first book. His is the first book that we actually read at least like halfway through, but at best cover to cover. And there's one line here, and I can't believe I'm quoting Adolf Hitler, but like Eric Hoffer points out that Hitler himself said that in terms of like, if you want to find someone that you can convert into Nazism, don't look at the moderate Democrat. Because the idea of being a moderate Democrat is, you're all open to pluralistic ideas. You ought to go to the communists. And so that's part of their agenda. So there are particular individuals who, probably are very susceptible to meaning vertigo and need, some sort of authority to hold on to. So if there's going to be other people who will champion other extremist beliefs when one extremist belief fails, then go for them. So that particular quote quote from Hitler that Eric Hoffer unpacks this in his book has really stayed with me.
Super. Louise, any thoughts on Eric Hoffer?
None to add.
Okay, well, as we're coming close to the end, I mean, there's a question here from Dana, which is, I guess, the classic kind of resolution question for a lot of what we've been discussing. So Dana asks, how do you bring people of various and opposing views to coexist in a harmonious society? I'm sorry if I can't read that. It just, I mean, at the moment, the way things are, it seems like a kind of an impossible dream. But Louise, do you have any thoughts on how we could at least try and do a little bit better?
Yeah, I think I revert back to this idea of resonance that I was talking about before. I mean, I think that all social change requires a bit of push and pull. So there needs to be some resonance, but there also needs to be some critique as well. And finding the balance of those two things in ways that become meaning generating for a large amount of people very quickly is quite challenging. Activism arguably does this to a certain extent, but so do the kind of media that we engage with, our different fictions that we engage with, and being able to have different experiences as well. So, I mean, obviously there's no silver bullet panacea, but I feel like always kind of trying to be cognizant of what are ways that I can make this resonant for someone who disagrees with me, and where within that more resonant story, can I introduce the critique as a different way of thinking about the issue?
Thank you, Louise. Tracy, your thoughts on Dana's question or Louise's response?
So yeah, very, very difficult question. I work one of the philosophers I read a lot is Richard Rorty, and he quotes Judith Shklar's conception of political liberalism, and the basis of which is the idea that cruelty is the worst thing we do. And I think this puts the spotlight on the idea that everyday social practices that we engage in the public sphere, the mean-spiritedness of it all, the nastiness, the combativeness, the aggression, like that seems to be prized in our society as evidence of having a strong and exemplary character. And that's at the expense of, the warm and fuzzy things, compassion, kindness, understanding, the ability to listen with empathy and care. And I just think like we take all of those things for granted. And because people are not being heard or being misunderstood, the louder and the angrier they get. So I think one way of thinking about it is like, why can't we behave the same way that, when you enter kindergarten and everything's chaotic, but then you come into an agreement that this is how we should function. We should be civil and kind, and we shouldn't be throwing our food to, onto the next classmate. Like, why can't those ordinary kind and, fuzzy feeling social practices be actually part of public discourse? And I just feel like that's what I take away from all of the polarization. Like there's just so much negativity and anger, and it's always at the expense of the attitudes and behaviors that actually make people feel good. Yeah, so if we could find a way where we champion those attitudes, then I think we might have a stab at getting a bit more harmonious.